Hi there and welcome to Hearthside. My name is Michelle. I am the author on this blog, and I am currently working on a 4-part series about the forest commons of Northern Europe and how they relate to modern heathen practice in Canada. This is part 3, which is going to be starting to focus more in on Canadian issues. I think this will also apply to a lot of other colonized areas where there's modern heathen practitioners. If you are from Europe and heathen and you're watching this, I also think this will be valuable for you as well, just to understand where heathens are coming from who don't live in Europe, to understand why the practices look different between Canada or America and Europe and other places as well, such as Australia, of course. But I'm coming from my own experience. So Canada I know best. I know a fair amount about American heathenry because the Americans are close by. Some of us are in the same time zone. So sometimes I attend events with American heathens as well. There's a lot of discussion going on back and forth there. But for the European heathens, I know I see it a lot online where they're kind of like, well, why do Americans do that? We don't do that. Hopefully this will give you guys some insights into that. And for everybody else, hopefully this will give you some insights into how the forest commons related to what happened with colonization here and the severance of people from the natural world, and how we can maybe go back into more harmony with nature, but also with the Indigenous communities where we live, that will create better relationships with us and these communities. So then I will just jump into what is going to be covered in this particular part. This, as I said, it's part 3. And we're going to talk about how the enclosure movement and industrial thinking shaped colonization in Canada, the pitfalls of the idea of blood-based ancestry, and then modern heathenry in Canada and how it's different from Northern Europe. We're also going to talk about importance of land stewardship and allyship with Indigenous peoples, how we can learn from the history of the forest commons and our shared history in order to find common ground with Indigenous people, and how to move past colonial ideas of land ownership towards the re-spiritualization of nature. So colonization in North America was largely informed by the enclosure movement in Northern Europe, as evidenced by Canadian Crown land. And you will recall, if you were viewing or reading my section about the history of the forest commons, that Crown land was something that came to exist out of the enclosure movement as the privatization of land occurred and noble people took large tracts of land for their own personal use. This carried over into Canada and other places that were colonized, where the Crown owned land sections called Crown land that were now privately owned. They weren't available necessarily for the use of the common people, or if they were, there was restricted use as to how they could be used. So we see that the creation of the enclosure and erasure of forest commons hurt both the common people and also the Indigenous populations in Northern Europe, such as the Sami. And we are seeing the same parallel between our relationships with Indigenous people of Canada and their struggles with land claims that are going on now, as well as with land stewardship. As I talked about in the History of the Forest Commons section, the intergenerational trauma of the Northern European people, as they became severed from the land of their ancestors, led them to inflicting violence on other landscapes and peoples around the globe. And they were severed from the land because they were forced from their homes into the industrialized cities in order to make a livelihood. So they became severed from the land in that way. The spirits of place became demonized by the church. But it became even more severe when settlers came over to new places, because on top of being severed with that connection with their land that they were still, by and large, living on within Europe, suddenly they're in a completely different land that they're unfamiliar with. So this is just perpetuating this trauma that occurred within the Northern European mindset. The industrialized Europe led to much more rapid severing of land and people than previous generations had experienced. And when paired with a Cartesian mindset, it allowed the natural world to be seen as soulless and therefore be commodified. When this was paired with the technological advances of the invention of steam power, which allowed for rapid travel and rapid depletion of resources in Northern Europe, this is when all these problems started to occur. And the need for more resources and the ability to travel rapidly led to the age of discovery. And please note that I am using discovery only for the purpose of understanding, and not because I think that North America or other colonized places were discovered by Europeans. So it led to the age of discovery, and by extension, the colonization of places around the globe, including what is now called Canada. So at this point, we're going to bring in some more cringy topics for the sake of the narrative. These are all important to build your basis of understanding about what's going on so that we can move towards healing, but the process is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of folks. And this concept is the concept of blood-based ancestry. As inclusive Canadian heathens, we probably have a better than average understanding of the existence of the belief of blood-based ancestry and its pitfalls. This is also true of inclusive heathens beyond Canada, in other regions that were colonized, and I would guess also among European heathens. But I feel like it's an even larger problem in colonized areas. So heathenry is the belief in the Nordic gods, such as Odin, Thor, Freya, and I'm saying that because I can't guarantee, with this being on the internet, that the only people who are reading and viewing my content are heathen. So it's important to establish what we're talking about so that there's not some confusion. So heathenry is the belief in Nordic gods. Heathen practice also includes ancestor veneration and the veneration of land spirits. Inclusive heathenry is a modern term used by heathens to signal that heathenry is an open practice that anyone of any background can participate in if they feel called to. So basically, inclusive heathenry refutes the importance of blood-based ancestry to heathen practice. So what is blood-based ancestry? And how did it originate in Northern Europe? And how did that affect our interactions with Indigenous people in Canada and around the world? The concept of blood-based ancestry originated in European nationalism, and this was an attempt by the ruling class to maintain control over the common people by giving them a new enemy that wasn't the ruling class. As dissatisfaction occurred as the result of industrialization, and the common people became disillusioned from losing connection with land and ancestors, the elite decided they were going to start to feed it back to them, but in a new and corrupted form, which was nationalism. Instead of identifying with family or community, the European common folk were urged to buy into a sense of belonging through a larger national identity. This kept the power with the state, instead of letting common people take it back. And this created the terrifying new face that is racism based on skin color. Nationalism created a segregation in which one's own nation was viewed as being greater than all others. And if your people were greater, then that meant that other people had to be less, and perhaps even less than human. So using this paired with the Cartesian mindset, where if you are less than human, you are no longer a person, you are a commodity. This is exactly what caused racism and what was leading to colonization and genocide against Indigenous peoples. But not just Indigenous people, but also it explains how we were able to other groups of people, for example, in the slave trade, and many other historic events that were occurring at this time. It explains it, it does not excuse it. And I'm sure that some of you are inevitably going to argue that people have always been horrible to those that they thought were other, and that it wasn't just the Northern Europeans that had this attitude. Okay, to an extent, that's true. Slaves existed before the transatlantic slave trade. Different groups fought over land and resources, and generally the losing party did not have a good go of it. But what nationalism allowed was this sort of destructive behavior on much larger scale than had ever been seen before in human history. So think of just how much land mass that existed in our world that was owned by the British Isles in the form of colonies. This tiny little island that controlled that much of the globe due to colonization. This is the devastation that we're talking about. The destruction of blood-based ancestry extended beyond just nationalism, racism, and colonization. The concept of blood-based ancestry is used to control Indigenous populations in Canada to this day. If you haven't heard of blood quantum in determining the status of First Nations people, that is probably a rabbit hole that you should explore on your own. I will give you a little bit of background, but I don't have time in this post, I'll be honest, to get into all the details of what that entails. So put in the most basic terms. If you aren't Indigenous enough, then the Canadian government doesn't have to count you as Indigenous, and therefore doesn't have to grant you the same things that other Indigenous people are entitled to under the treaties. And there's many things that could change your status and your children's status as a First Nations person in Canada historically. It's starting to change so that it is more difficult to lose your status, or people have been reinstated as a result of different legislation changes. But this is far from over. So historically, you could lose your status as a woman marrying a non-Indigenous man, or as an Indigenous person who is leaving their reservation for work, or just by becoming a professional such as a doctor or lawyer. Suddenly you were not considered to be status anymore. And it's only very recently that this has begun to change. This is all part of the legacy of colonization and the long-term cultural genocide that occurred in an attempt to eradicate Indigenous people from the Canadian landscape. And this has happened in other places too. I'm just going with what I know the most about here, which is the situation here in Canada. For those of you who are outside of Canada, this is not ancient history. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996, and many of the survivors of these schools that existed for the sole purpose of taking the Indian out of the child are still alive. And understand that Indian in this context is still legally used in Canada in the form of the legislation called the Indian Act, which describes Indigenous people. So the racism is written right into the law. As heathens, we need to be fully aware of blood-based ancestry and its effects on Indigenous people, but also on its continued effects in the heathen community. Modern heathenry has a sordid history, and we can't deny that for the sake of ease within the narrative. Modern heathenry was born out of the nationalist movement of Northern Europe as a way to reclaim a sense of our identity. The first modern heathens were nationalists, and many continue to be nationalists to this day. And it's the conception of modern heathenry that was designed to other people who were not of European descent. It's only more recently that the concept of inclusive heathenry emerged, and arguably now the majority of heathens would identify as inclusive heathens. But this means that we're trying to reclaim the pre-Christian Northern European religion without being exclusionary. We can't deny that originally we were trying to reclaim the pre-Christian Northern European religion and be exclusionary. There's value in modern heathenry because it's a way of reconnecting with the land and with our ancestors. This is necessary for decolonization of the Western mindset. Northern Europeans and people of Northern European descent need to go back to the trees. We need to heal ourselves. And if we don't, we're going to remain untethered from the land that we live on and continue to wreak havoc on the natural world. A lot of people have been talking recently about the healing that needs to occur in Northern European mindset in order to turn things around globally. I suggest that you check out Tyson Yunkaporta. He's an Indigenous Australian who's written the book Sand Talk and also hosts a podcast by the same name. His material's great, and him discussing what that Northern European mindset is that needs healing. Within modern heathenry, we need to remember that tradition is not the worship of the ashes, it's the preservation of the fire. And what I mean is that decolonization of our Western mindset is an ongoing process. We need to heal ourselves in order to be able to relate to Indigenous people from around the world and the lands that they live on. And this means that the healing of this mindset differs between locations. Modern heathens in Northern Europe are more easily able to reconnect to the land and the ancestors as they have not been displaced from their ancestral homes. But all of us need to heal ourselves, and in order to create a modern heathenry that does that, or a modern mindset in general that does that, then we need to preserve the fire. The ashes are dead, or if not dead, not necessarily useful in maintaining the flame now. I know that there's lots of heathens in Northern Europe that are confused by the approach of modern heathens in North America, and we're criticized a lot for how we place too much value on tracing back lineages to Northern Europe. And simultaneously, we're being met with all sorts of criticism and surprise that we are actually able to trace back our lineages that far, as many generations in name as we're able to do. Why are we able to do that? Because blood-based ancestry held so much more value to people who had to relocate to North America or other places for their livelihoods, often against their will. The stories of ancestors and lineages are what kept them going in a strange land. And you can see that within Canada. If you think of Quebec as a good example, if you look at the French language of the Quebec people, it is much closer to historic French and not modern French in France. And the reason is because we clung so tightly to what we remembered of the places that our ancestors came from, because that was what kept us going. That was the thing that we had to cling to make sense of our identity. So blood-based ancestry is super dangerous in that it causes destruction and rupture between groups of people, but it's also what gave ancestors of those that moved to new places around the globe a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging. And it's not something that we can just let go overnight, because this is how we established our identities in a new country. So from that complicated place, we're trying to emerge, remembering our roots, while slowly extracting ourselves from the layers of ideologies that are harmful to us, to our communities, and to the world around us. And it's especially tricky as we don't have the same connection to the land that we live on that heathens in Northern Europe can take for granted. We have to build something new in a new land, using pieces of old traditions, but that on its own is not enough to create a structure. We are rewriting heathenry to fit our landscape here in Canada and in other colonized places around the world, largely through trial and error. And a piece of that is understanding our relationship to the land here now, and our relationships as they continue to evolve with Indigenous populations. So in order to understand relationships with the land and relationships with Indigenous people, I want to put forward a bit of a thought experiment at this point. The idea is to imagine what Canada would be like if it had modern forest commons like those found in Northern Europe. Now, the intention of this is not that this thought experiment should ever be carried out, because that's just us as the colonizers trying to impose another system upon a land that it isn't the best fit. But the purpose instead is to decolonize our thinking about the land by looking at how the forest commons benefit people and environment. So trying to think past all those layers of industrialization, Christianization, to a time before. So by taking this thought that existed for Northern European people hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and then thinking about it in a more modern sense, then we can hopefully identify what's lacking on our relationship with the land here in Canada, how we can use this knowledge to ally with Indigenous peoples in their own initiatives to protect the land. And that's important. It must be Indigenous driven. So, understanding how the forest commons can benefit land stewardship in Canada. The main three things that we need to think about are the right to roam, which is what allows equity in forest use and builds connections between people and the land. And then forest management, so the shared management by diverse communities that allows us to help each other and learn from each other. And the final thing is decentralization. So taking the power away from industry and from the federal level and putting it into the hands of local communities. So what would this look like in a theoretical world? The establishment of forest commons in Canada would give more opportunities for people to connect with the land and take pride in maintaining this shared resource. In Canada, we don't currently have the right to roam. And so many people, especially living in cities, don't feel any connection to the land and therefore don't recognize the importance of preserving the environment for our continued well-being. We're so disconnected, like some of us, we don't even realize where our food comes from. There are very few Canadians who are familiar with subsistence living, and many don't even fully understand where their food or other resources are coming from. Canadians, and in particular non-Indigenous Canadians, may not have familiarity with the land around us or its natural resources. We often don't know the properties of different plants or the cycles of plants and animals in relation to Canadian seasons. We are completely out of tune with nature, and we don't have the traditional knowledge for this place that was passed down orally between Indigenous people of this land. So decentralization of management of Crown land would provide more opportunities for the well-being of all Canadians. This concept of everyone having an equitable share in common resources in order to satisfy needs is called a moral economy. And in order for this to be successful, we would have to relearn subsistence living and traditional skill sets. Learning about things like the honorable harvest and practices like this could help to inform Canadians about subsistence living and maintaining the environment equitably for humans and non-humans alike. We would have to have new legislation against the exploitation of natural resources for profit, and having smaller communities manage the resources locally allows those who are most knowledgeable in that region to be able to make the decisions that will help to sustain the natural environment. Shared interest in the land stewardship would help us maintain biodiversity for generations. We need to look to Indigenous people to learn the best ways to preserve the land for future generations. And this is so often overlooked, the importance of listening to Indigenous land activists, Indigenous knowledge keepers. And I'm just going to take this example of a story that I know about from growing up in British Columbia. And how the Indigenous people knew how to create sustainable practices within a region. So in British Columbia, many of you know that in recent times there have been tons of large wildfires. And like often, even if you're in a different province, the smoke carries in the summer. And it's absolutely devastating. But the Indigenous people knew how to prevent this. And for years, they were banned from their traditional practices that could have prevented this from happening. The Indigenous people historically started controlled burns in forests. And when the government forbade this practice, for many, many years, the results were disastrous. This caused layer upon layer of evergreen needles to compact on the forest floor. And these dried out needles were ready to ignite the whole mountainside with one spark, and led to years and years of forest fires that are now faced by British Columbians, and which endangered whole communities. And in addition, there's traditional knowledge saying that certain plants within British Columbia have adaptive traits that only allow them to propagate after a forest fire. So that meant that selective burning actually leads to greater biodiversity in the region. So that's just one example. Things like this are happening across our country all the time that we don't even necessarily hear about. If we had have listened to the Indigenous people in this region sooner, we could have prevented mass devastation. Here's where we need to think about learning from history. The history of colonization in Canada and past relationships with Indigenous people have been sorted. And in order to move forward, we need to practice active listening in all of our dealings with Indigenous people to help heal our shared history. We also need to learn from what did and did not work within the forest commons in Northern Europe, as it helps us to create a cultural basis of understanding of the land and our relationships to it. So we can see that there is a need to share the land and not fight between ethnic groups over land usage rights. We also want to make sure that the land that we keep in Canada to avoid the depletion of biodiversity is not always the poorest tract of land, or we're going to perpetuate the problem. And that's so common that as a practice in Canada, that land that's set aside for uses that are not industrial quite often is the poorest tracts of land, and that's not sustainable. The way forward is going to be grassroots, inclusive, and about building community for the common good. How can we find common ground in all of this? There's a lot to unpack here, and it seems daunting. So this is an argument for using the forest common model to help relate to Indigenous people and to understand how land was used before the introduction of the enclosure movement. The history of the forest commons lets us think about how land usage can protect humans and non-humans through sustainability of natural resources. The forest commons can be used as a basis of understanding for the land back movement and what it's about. We need to inform ourselves of Indigenous movements and how we can be allies to help the land stewardship in Canada. I'll post a bunch of links related to that topic below. But as I say, this forest common model is only a thought experiment because it allows us to see the land through a pre-colonized mindset. Any movement forward needs to be as allies to Indigenous movements because they know this land best. I suggest you looking into the land back movement, Water is Life, and also to do with land consultation issues that are happening in Canada to do with logging and mineral extraction. I'm going to end this section by just saying that the heathen understanding of the natural world is something that makes us natural allies with Indigenous people through the sharing of stories and cultures and helping to deepen our understanding and connection with the world around us and with each other. That's what our next section is going to be about. I'm going to start taking stories from our different cultures and sharing them to see what is similar and where we can establish this common ground. I know this section was super heavy. Well, I mean, other than the introduction section, everything's been heavy, but this one's been emotionally heavy. And there's a lot to take in. You might need to go back a couple times just to make sure that you got it all. I suggest looking at things in my further reading section. These are things about Indigenous people and their initiatives, about what land back is, about environmental stewardship, and being allies with Indigenous people. I hope that you are enjoying this series so far. We're coming into section 4 now, and I will see you shortly for that. Goodbye.